When you consider going no contact with a narcissist, the first thing that usually rises to the surface is a mix of fear and relief. Relief, because you are finally breaking free from an ongoing cycle of chaos, confusion, manipulation, and cruelty. Fear, because the very act of stepping away from someone like this often feels like you are walking into an emotional battlefield, where the rules are unclear and the risks are everywhere. And this is where the biggest risk begins, not in losing them, but in confronting everything that comes after you've cut off access. Because the truth is, no contact isn't a magic wand. It isn't something you do once and suddenly the pain is gone, your confidence is restored, and your sense of self is intact. No contact is a process, and it often exposes you to some of the hardest internal battles you've ever faced. It takes courage, but it also demands a willingness to sit with some very uncomfortable truths about yourself, your past, and the person you're detaching from. And that is why it feels like such a risk. Because you're not just breaking away from them. You're breaking away from the entire system of dynamics you've been surviving in, sometimes for years. The biggest risk of going no contact is not just what they might do. It's what you might feel. You may think you're prepared for their rage, their smear campaigns, their attempts to lure you back with fake apologies, tears, or promises. You may think you're ready to withstand the flying monkeys they send into your life to guilt you, shame you, or tell you you're overreacting. But what often takes people by surprise is the silence, the absence, the void. The deafening quiet that happens when they no longer occupy your daily life. Because even though they brought toxicity, they also brought familiarity. And familiarity, even when it's destructive, has a strange kind of comfort. When you go no contact, you are removing the drama that has been both your prison and your routine. Suddenly, there are no more texts flooding your phone with accusations. No more roller coaster mornings where you don't know which version of them you'll wake up to. No more having to explain yourself endlessly or defend choices that should never have been questioned in the first place. But that silence can feel almost unbearable. You may start doubting yourself. Did you do the right thing? Were you too harsh? Could they have changed if you had given them one more chance? And that self-doubt can be one of the most dangerous traps after going no contact, because it tempts you to open the door again just to quiet the discomfort of missing someone who was never really safe to begin with. Another risk you face is the identity crisis that often follows. Narcissistic relationships have a way of eroding your sense of who you are. You may have spent so long bending, shrinking, and adjusting yourself to avoid conflict or to earn their approval that when they are suddenly gone, you're left with questions you can't easily answer. Who am I without them? What do I like? What do I value? How do I make decisions without their voice in my head? And it can feel overwhelming to realize just how much of yourself was wrapped up in surviving them. No contact doesn't just mean losing them. It can mean losing the parts of yourself that you didn't even know you lost until the silence forced you to see it. There's also the risk of grief. This may sound strange to some, because why would you grieve someone who hurt you so deeply? But grief doesn't follow logic. You don't only grieve the good people in your life, you grieve the idea of what you thought you had, what you hoped for, and what you kept holding on to even as the truth was tearing you apart. Going no contact forces you to finally put those hopes to rest, and that can feel devastating. You might find yourself crying not just for what you lost, but for what never was. And that kind of grief can leave you vulnerable to nostalgia, to selective memory, to only remembering the rare moments of kindness while minimizing the mountain of cruelty. And that selective memory can be dangerous because it often leads people to break no contact and re-enter the cycle they worked so hard to escape. But perhaps the most significant risk of going no contact is that it forces you to confront the deepest part of the healing process, the part where you stop waiting for closure from them and instead create it for yourself. Narcissists do not hand out closure. They thrive on leaving questions unanswered, on keeping you tethered to the what ifs, on making you doubt your own narrative. No contact removes the option of ever getting that apology you keep secretly hoping for, that acknowledgement of the harm they caused, that moment where they finally say, "You were right, I was wrong." And when you remove contact, you are left staring at the reality that this moment is never coming. The risk is that you may linger in that space of unfinished business, waiting for a validation that will never arrive. And unless you learn to validate yourself, the silence will feel suffocating. And then, of course, there is the external risk, their reaction. Narcissists hate losing control. When you go no contact, you're not just stepping away from a relationship. You're taking away their supply. Their sense of power, their ability to manipulate you, their control over your emotions, that disappears when you cut the cord. And that can trigger retaliation. They may smear your name, paint you as the villain, tell mutual friends and family that you're unstable, selfish, or cruel. They may use guilt, threats, or even legal means to try to pull you back into their orbit. And that can feel terrifying, especially if you've lived under their intimidation for a long time. The risk here is real, and it requires preparation, support, and sometimes even professional help to navigate. But even with all of these risks, the grief, the silence, the self-doubt, the identity crisis, the retaliation, the alternative is even riskier. Because staying in contact means continuing the cycle of abuse, continuing to lose yourself piece by piece, continuing to live in a world where your reality is dismissed, your needs are minimized, and your worth is constantly questioned. No contact may carry risks, but staying in contact carries the guarantee of harm. So the real work after going no contact is not just about avoiding them. It's about rebuilding you. It's about learning to sit in the silence without rushing to fill it with their chaos. It's about learning to see grief not as a weakness, but as evidence that you are finally mourning something you should have never had to endure. It's about reclaiming your identity piece by piece, rediscovering what you love, what you value, and who you are outside of their shadow. It's about reminding yourself that closure does not come from their lips. It comes from your decision to close the door and not reopen it. The biggest risk of going no contact is that you will underestimate your own strength, that you will forget in the moments of weakness that you are capable of building a life that is free, peaceful, and grounded in reality rather than fantasy. That you will believe the lie that their presence is better than the emptiness you feel in their absence. But if you can hold steady, if you can trust the process, if you can allow yourself to move through the grief, the silence, the identity rebuilding, and the backlash, you will eventually discover that the real risk was never in leaving. It was in staying. Because on the other side of no contact is not just survival, it's freedom, it's clarity, it's self-respect. And it's the realization that the most dangerous thing you could have ever done was give them continued access to your life. The risk of going no contact is real, but it is also the path to reclaiming your voice, your peace, and your future. And when you get there, when you finally taste the quiet not as emptiness, but as peace, you will understand that the risk was worth it. When you first step into no contact, the quiet can feel almost unbearable. For so long, your nervous system has been wired to expect their chaos. Whether that meant the endless arguments, the unpredictable mood swings, or the constant accusations, the noise of their presence, as exhausting as it was, became familiar. And when that noise is gone, it leaves behind a silence that feels foreign, almost threatening. That's why so many people underestimate this stage. They expect relief to flood in immediately, but instead they encounter a kind of void. The human mind doesn't like voids. It likes patterns, even destructive ones. So your mind may start replaying old memories, softening them, focusing on the good moments while minimizing the bad. This selective memory is what drives many people back into the cycle, not because they want the abuse, but because the silence feels more unbearable than the noise. In that silence, self-doubt becomes loud. You may start asking yourself if you overreacted, if you could have tried harder, or if the relationship was really as toxic as you remember. The lack of drama can feel almost like withdrawal. That's because it is. Your body and brain became conditioned to the adrenaline, the cortisol, and the constant state of vigilance. Without it, there's a strange emptiness. Many confuse this emptiness with loneliness for the narcissist, when in reality, it is the nervous system learning to regulate without chaos. This is why the silence is so dangerous. It tricks you into believing that their presence was better than their absence. But the silence is not your enemy. It's an invitation to heal, to learn what peace feels like, and to create a new baseline where calm isn't frightening, but freeing. When you go no contact, you aren't just walking away from a toxic relationship. You are also stepping into a confrontation with yourself. Narcissistic relationships have a way of swallowing your identity piece by piece. Over time, you learn to shrink your needs, silence your voice, and shape your choices around keeping the peace or avoiding their wrath. When that person is suddenly no longer there, it can feel disorienting. You're left staring at a version of yourself you may not fully recognize. The question rises quietly, but powerfully. Who am I without them? That question can stir up anxiety, confusion, and even fear, because so much of your daily existence was built on surviving their patterns. Alongside the identity shift comes grief. And this is often one of the most unexpected risks of no contact. You might expect to feel anger or even relief, but grief can arrive like a wave you weren't prepared for. You're grieving not just the loss of the person, but the loss of the dream you held on to for so long. The fantasy that if you loved them enough, they would change, or that the relationship could one day be what you always hoped it would be. That grief is real, even if the relationship was toxic. It's the grief of realizing that the story you told yourself about them and about your future together will never unfold the way you imagined. This mix of identity loss and grief can create powerful vulnerability. It can tempt you to minimize the harm and romanticize the rare moments of tenderness. But these feelings, as painful as they are also evidence that you are healing. They're proof that you're beginning to separate their identity from yours, and that you're finally grieving something you never should have had to endure. One of the hardest truths about going no contact is realizing that closure will never come from them. Deep down, many people still hope for that one conversation where the narcissist finally admits the harm they caused offers a genuine apology, or validates the years of pain. But that moment never comes because narcissists are not wired for accountability. Their survival depends on denial, deflection, and blame shifting. Waiting for them to give you closure is like waiting for someone who broke you to suddenly become the person who heals you. It simply isn't going to happen. This lack of closure can feel like a risk because it leaves you sitting with unfinished business. There are questions you'll never get answers to and explanations you'll never hear. That void can gnaw at you, making you believe that if you broke no contact just once, maybe you could finally get the understanding you crave. But every attempt to go back for closure only pulls you deeper into their cycle of manipulation because they don't resolve the past, they rewrite it. They gaslight you, deny events, or twist the narrative until you doubt yourself all over again. Instead of healing, you end up reopening old wounds. The real challenge, then, is learning to create closure on your own. It means giving yourself permission to validate your own story, to say to yourself, what I experienced was real, it was harmful, and it matters. It's choosing to accept that their silence, denial, or blame does not erase your truth. This shift is uncomfortable because it forces you to let go of the fantasy that they'll ever be who you needed them to be. But it's also liberating because it gives you back the power to define your own reality and move forward without waiting for something that will never arrive. When you decide to go no contact, you are taking away the one thing a narcissist cannot live without: control. And that loss does not sit quietly. Often, their reaction is immediate and volatile. They may launch smear campaigns, spreading lies about you to friends, family, or coworkers, painting themselves as the victim and you as the villain. They may use guilt, reminding you of everything they've supposedly done for you, or play the martyr, accusing you of being cold or heartless. Some may escalate to intimidation, threats, or even legal maneuvers just to reestablish a connection. These reactions can feel terrifying, and they can make you question whether no contact is worth the fight it stirs up. This is where the risk feels very real, because their retaliation is not just in your imagination. It's their way of trying to destabilize you and drag you back into the chaos. For many, it's exhausting to deal with the waves of manipulation that come after cutting ties. The narcissist may even enlist allies, known as flying monkeys, who reach out to you on their behalf, pressuring you to reconcile or shaming you for walking away. These tactics are designed to weaken your resolve and remind you of the old power imbalance. But even with these challenges, the greater risk lies in staying connected, because while no contact may provoke a storm in the short term, maintaining contact guarantees a storm that never ends. The emotional erosion, the constant invalidation, the ongoing psychological harm, those are certainties as long as they have access to you. Choosing no contact means facing turbulence, now for the sake of long-term peace. It's an act of reclaiming control over your life, even if it comes with the price of enduring their backlash. The decision to go no contact with a narcissist is never simple, and it carries risks that can feel heavy and unsettling. The silence can seem louder than the noise you escaped. Grief and identity loss can feel overwhelming. Closure may remain forever out of reach, and their reactions can be chaotic and cruel. But each of these risks is part of the process of breaking free, of peeling back the layers of manipulation, and finally seeing your own worth. What feels unbearable at first is actually the beginning of healing. The quiet that once felt empty slowly becomes peace. The grief that felt crushing transforms into clarity. The lack of closure becomes an opening for you to validate your own stories. And the backlash that once seemed frightening reveals your growing strength to stand on your own. No contact isn't just about cutting them off. It's about choosing yourself, choosing freedom, and choosing a future that isn't defined by their control. The greatest risk was never leaving. The greatest risk was always staying.